Usually I say I'm a theoretical astrophysicist. I think most people don't know what a theoretical astrophysicist is, so it's probably not a useful description, but the reason I say that is that I do theoretical work, so I don't use telescopes, and I study the physics of the cosmos, which is what astrophysics is. To be more specific, you could say I'm a cosmologist, so I study the beginning of the universe to the end of the universe and how things change over time on the largest scales. I've always wanted to be a scientist, I think. I've always wanted to understand how things work. So that started with taking stuff apart at home, you know, the remote control for the TV or whatever, and trying to understand how that all fits together. And then it extended to, you know, the whole universe. I think when I was probably around 10 years old, I started to hear about like Stephen Hawking and A Brief History of Time and black holes and space-time and, you know, all of that cool mind-bending stuff. And I found out that the job that Stephen Hawking has, he's called a cosmologist. And so I said, okay, I want to be a cosmologist. I want to do that stuff. I want to think about those things. You know, I pictured it being like, you know, you have a little office and a big blackboard and you just write equations all day, or you like sit under a tree with your notepad and you write down equations and then you come up with big ideas and then you solve the universe, right? Like I thought it would be more like that. And you know, there are days when there things happen like that where I do spend a lot of time writing down equations and sitting in a cafe with a notepad, just thinking about stuff. But there's a lot more talking to people, there's a lot more writing papers, writing code, giving presentations, applying for funding, you know, all of those things. But I mean, fundamentally, you know, the idea that there is a lot of deep thinking and equations, that part is still true, but it's a lot less isolated than I thought it would be. And I don't know why it appealed to me at the time, the idea of sort of sitting alone in an office with my equations. But when I was a kid, I thought that sounded really cool. And now there's a lot more sitting in somebody else's office and talking about equations with them, for example. So it's a lot less of the sort of lone genius stereotype for the most part than I thought it would be. And that's, I think, a good thing, but it's a little bit different than I imagined because, you know, that's what you see on TV, right? You see the lone genius with the whiteboard or the blackboard, you know, just writing equations and not talking to anybody and never actually publishing a paper, just doing the math, and it's not like that. It's fantastically exciting to understand the universe better. I get excited when I understand something I didn't understand before. I get excited when I come up with an idea that might turn out to be interesting when it's actually like fleshed out and calculated. I get excited when somebody else has a new result that's really cool. When you come up with something new or learn something new, or especially when you're the first person to understand something that wasn't understood at all before, you know, when you can be a person to discover something. And that's not always like discovering a planet, like finding something out there that has been out there that nobody knew about, but like discovering an idea or some connection between two ideas that nobody had talked about before. Like that gets really exciting. I was at this theoretical physics conference 2 weeks ago, and they were talking about finding new mathematical structures to describe particles scattering off each other. There was something about it that's so, I don't know how to explain it. It's sort of awe-inspiring and sort of sublime and sort of like satisfying to think, and almost I don't know, unsettling to think that this mathematical structure might be important at the root of reality, you know, like that might really tell us something about how the universe is shaped, how it works, what the fundamental aspects of the universe really are. And this particular model was something that can change the way you think about space and time. I mean, ultimately, which is an amazing idea, right? And somehow implies that space and time, the way we think of it, are not the fundamental aspects of the universe, but it works in this other way that can be described by this other kind of mathematics, and that if you understand that mathematical structure, then you understand something really, really deep about how the universe works. And like I sort of got goosebumps thinking about that, like that we can understand something so fundamental about the workings of the universe by conceptualizing it in this mathematical way. And both the mathematics and the idea of the abstract concepts of the universe are incredibly beautiful to me. And so finding a connection between those two and the realization that we have created as a thinking species, we've created a system of abstract structures that corresponds to stuff that actually happens in the world is amazing. And I just love thinking about that stuff. And most of the work that I do is not in that field. I don't really work on like the nature of ultimate reality. That's a sort of different subfield than me, but I can appreciate some of it, and I can kind of see how some of it fits together, and I feel like that's such a privilege, you know, like I feel very lucky and happy to be in a position where I can start to understand some of that. I guess when I was younger, I thought that there were like a couple of big questions, and you have an idea and then you approach that big question and then you answer the big question, and it's a lot more complicated. Like there are a lot of small questions that we all have to answer first, and people work on very different aspects of those, and sometimes get very, very specialized in what they do. There are so many things that are very difficult to understand, very complicated, very uncertain, and there's constantly new research coming out, and it's kind of impossible to know all of it, to understand everything. I think, you know, maybe there was a time in the past where if you were a physicist, you could know pretty much all of known physics on your own, and that is not true now. Even in just one subfield like cosmology, there's so much going on all the time, and people are publishing papers every day, and you look at the online archive where we post preprints of papers that we're writing. Just in astrophysics, there's something like 100 a day. Each subfield has a huge amount of literature coming out every single day, and each of these papers represents months and months of work by several people usually. And the papers themselves are often, 20 pages long or something. And so understanding everything, keeping up with everything is impossible. There's a lot of trying to choose interesting questions to ask in a sea of interesting questions, in a huge landscape of things that we don't know. And that's just the idea part. And then there's the actual implementation and doing the calculations and writing the papers, and that takes a whole other set of skills. I was really nervous about going into research because I knew that one of the things you have to do as a researcher is to come up with new questions that haven't been asked before and answer them. And I had no idea how to do that. I thought that must be really hard. And now that I've been a researcher for a number of years, that's not the hard part at all. There are a million, I have a stack of questions I want to answer and good, interesting projects to do. The harder part is prioritizing them and finding time and choosing which ones are going to be the most fruitful. People think that it's just a matter of Eureka moments, oh, here's an idea of the universe and I've solved it, and that's not it at all. Ideas are sort of a dime a dozen. It's more putting that into a usable format that's hard. I think for the most part, people who are doing good and interesting work in physics, if they're recognized at all, are recognized in their lifetime. But the extent to which the work was important might not always be seen right away. If you're a theorist and you want to get a Nobel Prize, you have to make sure that whatever you come up with can be tested within your lifetime, because you won't get a prize for something that hasn't been proven to be real and important in the universe. It's possible to come up with an idea, but by the time it's confirmed, you're dead. It's certainly true that an idea might take a very long time to become important. I mean, Einstein had this idea about the cosmological constant and thought it was a terrible idea at the time. Turns out to probably be the dominant force in the universe right now. Just we didn't have the technology to figure that out when Einstein came up with it. Getting scooped by somebody else can be massively frustrating. So if you have an idea and you're working on this project and then somebody else publishes that idea, that can be really demoralizing. A friend of mine was working on a project where he'd spent, a couple of months doing some calculation, and then before he was able to publish it, somebody else published a paper that included that calculation and 4 other really interesting ones. And it was just, that's really upsetting, right? That stuff can happen, and it's one of the things that kind of gives you an impetus to hurry and get stuff out, because while you're working on it, somebody else might also be working on it. You don't necessarily know that, and then if they publish it, being the second person to come up with something interesting is not as good. That said, it's usually worth publishing anyway, because you might have done it differently, you might have had a slightly different answer, a slightly different approach, maybe there's something useful in both papers, but you really want to be the first one. The way humans do science and the institutions of science and the way humans approach, things scientifically can often be so subject to biases and to prejudices and to institutional baggage. I have very mixed feelings about, when people say, oh, I love science, or we have to value science and do everything scientifically, because we're people doing a thing, and people are very often unaware of their own biases, so they think they're doing this very, objective scientific method thing, and that's not true at all. I love the process of it. I love that kind of method of investigation, but I also am very aware of the shortcomings of trying to approach the world in that way and where people go wrong. It's a problem that's hard to discuss sometimes within the scientific community, because so many people want to think that they're just these very objective people judging everyone by merit. And so if you talk about systemic inequality and biases and the fact that women get fewer citations than men on average, even for work that's just as good, or if you talk about the fact that there's a huge problem in terms of ethnic diversity in science and people are systemically discouraged from getting into science or treated terribly when they're here, we need to value diversity, and we need to actively welcome people who are not part of the sort of default demographic in science. I really try to promote a more responsible, more welcoming kind of attitude in science, and I try to encourage people to work to correct those inequalities. And when I become a professor, I will actively work on that myself as much as I can. It's a little bit difficult as a postdoc because you don't have a lot of power. It's a little easier when you have more power. But the problem is the people who have power came up through the system that has the stuff built into it. And so changing the way we evaluate people, changing the way we bring people into the field, it's a hard sell for people who got into it just fine the way things are now. It's hard to get people to say, the system that accepted me is bad, and we should change it in ways that it might not accept me anymore. It's very hard to convince people to do that. But it's something that I think is incredibly important. So, I do try. I know I don't do enough. I know that there's much more that I should be doing to change the culture of science and to make it better for people who have a terrible time. I find it very frustrating when people act like it's not important, or like the only thing that matters is that we, solve this equation, right? Like that's never been what science is like. That's never been how it's done. There's always political things, there's always trends, and there's always fashions and judgments on people that have nothing to do with how mathematical their minds are or whatever. Like it's never been a meritocracy, and it's never been a place where all ideas are treated equally. The fact that we now have this structure where we can talk about science to the general public and, within the scientific community in this much bigger, louder way through things like social media. It does change a lot. It changes the conversations people have about the systems of science. It does allow people who didn't have a voice before to have a voice. Having a voice isn't the same as having power. With a voice, you can sometimes convince people who have power to make change. That's not always easy. You can make people aware of things that they weren't aware of before. That's a lot of what I try to do. So it's an interesting development, this whole social media thing, and my own sort of prominence in that is an unexpected thing. It's put me into a very weird position because most of the people who have that kind of prominence in something like social media are people who are very well established in their careers, and I'm just getting started, really. I'm constantly second-guessing everything. Some of that is healthy science, like you're supposed to be a skeptic about things and you're supposed to always ask questions. And some of it is just being massively underconfident about everything, which is, I think, a very common thing in science. In academia, we talk about something called imposter syndrome, which is this idea that if everybody knew how unqualified they really were, then they'd be laughed out of the department, and it's only because they've managed to somehow fool everyone that they're tolerated in their position. And most people have this feeling at some point in their careers. Most people have it a lot, and this idea that there's been a mistake, I'm not really supposed to be here, but I'm just gonna keep going and see how it works out. Like that kind of, I feel like I do that a lot, where like I don't know if I'm really qualified enough, or if I should get this job that I've gotten, like if that was a mistake, I don't know. The way I kind of try and deal with it is like, well, I'm gonna keep going anyway and try and just keep doing science, and hopefully it'll work out really well, and hopefully I'll make some contribution and it won't be terrible. So in my career, I deal with that kind of doubt all the time, and trying not to let it get to me too much, which is hard, especially when you're applying for jobs and you don't have one. The hardest thing is to try to convince yourself you're actually good at what you do, or that you deserve a job at all. Like that's really difficult, especially when there's so much rejection in academia. I mean, applying for grants, the success rates are usually around 10-20%, right? 20-30%, somewhere around there. You constantly are putting yourself out there and putting yourself out there and putting yourself out there and getting nothing, right? Like it happens all the time. The amount of like worry that you're not actually very good can be overwhelming sometimes. In my career in general, I'm constantly filled with this kind of doubt of like, am I actually good at this? Is this work really good? Have I gotten the right answer to this thing? Can I trust those calculations? All of that, all the time. And then with something like social media, where I have this big voice, everything I put out there, like every tweet I send, could be something that comes back and haunts me years later, or something that causes a huge uproar. I have to try and balance out, like, I do want to say something about this versus could this cause me problems? So I fact check my tweets a lot. So before I tweet something, I'll often go and just double check that I've got that thing right, because there's a lot of people who see my statements, and I want to, try and be responsible about that. But just like being constantly plagued by doubt, I think it's normal in academia, because the structures of academia sort of encourage that. Healthy skepticism about your own work is useful, because then you check it better, and you're supposed to try and verify things. Like that's important. But so many people are just like, just constantly lacking confidence in their own work, and there's not a lot of like positive reinforcement. There's not a lot of praise you get. But, like you give a talk, people will clap afterward. Sometimes people will tell you it was a good talk. Sometimes if you put out a paper, they'll say, oh, that was a nice idea, that was a nice paper. It usually doesn't get much more effusive than that, unless you're winning prizes, which very few people do. So for the most part, you get criticism. People will say, did you consider this? Maybe you should try that. People will say, oh, this paper, they didn't do this thing or they didn't do that thing. Sometimes you'll get a paper rejected or you'll get a grant proposal rejected. You'll apply for a job and they'll say, well, there were many qualified candidates and unfortunately we went with one of the other. You get a constant stream of negative criticism and you have to learn to use that in a positive way, but that's not easy. And the positive feedback is usually not very immediate. You don't have somebody coming to your office every day and being like, good job. That doesn't happen. So I think that one of the things that I get out of doing public outreach is that when I talk to an audience of people who are not physicists, they're much more impressed by the things that I talk about, and that kind of well, that was amazing. I don't get that when I give a physics talk at a physics department, but I get that sometimes when I give a talk for a general audience. So it's one of the things that helps me sort of keep perspective on I actually do know something, is talking to people who are not part of the field, because it's much more acceptable for them to be like, that was amazing, and to be effusive in that way. I mean, one of my friends was doing a postdoc, and he was writing some kind of grant proposal or something, and he gave it to his supervisor to get feedback, and got a lot of negative feedback, and gave it back again, and got more negative feedback, and useful suggestions. But at some point he went to his advisor and said, okay, is there anything good about this? And his advisor said, I don't think there's any point in giving positive feedback. It's only the negative feedback that's useful. It's wow, this is a very common attitude, I think, in academia. That's not often expressed in that way, but it can be hard to not have those massive doubts when you don't ever hear anybody say you did great. Sometimes you need that.